Hello, welcome to Global Online Academy's Catalyst Conference and a conversation with Robert Mahoney, Deputy Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. My name is Nelson Graves, and I'm speaking to you from Paris, France. I'm the founder of the educational news service News Decoder, and I'll be your moderator today. And joining me on camera from New York is our guest, Robert Mahoney.
Hi, nice to meet you all.
The camera. Hello, Robert.
Good afternoon. Nelson.
Right.
Oh, happy to be here.
Our topic today is, what does great advocacy look like? But first, a word on housekeeping. We like these sessions to be as interactive as possible, and for that reason, we have a chat room at the bottom of your screen, and you can use it to ask questions or make comments at any time, and I encourage you to do so. Now, normally at this stage, I'd launch into an introduction of our speaker. I'd list the places that you've worked, Robert: Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and say that you now work at the Committee to Protect Journalists, the preeminent NGO for defending the rights and safety of journalists around the world. But I'm a big believer in the adage that it's not the destination that counts, it's the getting there. And if this is billed as a conversation, it's because students who are listening in want to know what you do, Robert, but above all, they want to know how you got there and why. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Robert? Where were you born, schooled? What were your first steps that ended up taking you to where you are now? In other words, where did it all begin? And by the way, why are you Robert Mahoney and not Robert Mahoney?
Well, Mahoney is how it's pronounced in Ireland, and it's an Irish name. Although here in the United States and in Canada, everybody calls me Mahoney, so I've kind of just got used to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I mean, I grew up in a Welsh mining village in South Wales with a father who was of Irish ancestry and a mother who was of Welsh ancestry. And I loved it, but I couldn't wait to get out of there. So one of the things that I wanted to do was travel. I went to school in Wales. I went to university in England, but I saw my destiny as being able to travel, to be able to meet people, and I really wanted to be able to engage with people, not just as a tourist, but as someone who could learn about countries. And the pathway that opened up for me was journalism. There I found, very fortuitously, a company that would not only help me get overseas, but would pay me to stay there, pay me to meet people, pay me to write stories and do the things that I wanted to do. I didn't know immediately what I wanted to do, but once I started traveling, that was the job for me, and I've done nothing ever since. And it's been nearly 40 years that I've been doing journalism or related. I never thought I would become an advocate, because what I wanted to do was tell stories, and that's what journalism is about. I started off where you are, in Paris, and worked there for a few years, and then I wanted to go to Asia. And so I was sent to Southeast Asia and spent 7 years knocking around, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, covering all kinds of stories. And you cover conflict, which people think of as foreign correspondence, but you'd also be able to just meet people and really get into their culture and tell their stories. I mean, one day I remember I was sent by Reuters, that I worked for at the time. I had a friend who was a geologist, and they discovered the world's biggest caves in Borneo. And he said, "I'm going, would you like to come?" "Sure," I said. So there I am, miles from anywhere in the middle of the jungle, swimming in a pool, going to write a story about this fantastic natural phenomenon. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm actually getting paid to be here. So it was great. I loved it. That's where I started. And I
Can I just interrupt? How did you know you were interested in journalism? I could myself. One reason I joined Reuters was the reason people joined the Navy in the past was to see the world. But how did you know that journalism would be a ticket to go around the world, and why did it attract you?
Because it was one of the few jobs where it gave you the opportunity to talk to people, to ask them questions, and to hear their stories. For me, it was all about wanting to engage and find out what people were really like, what they thought. You could join the Navy, but you're not going to interact with local people. If you join the Navy, you're doing a different job. You could become, I don't know, a businessman or a trader or something, but it wouldn't necessarily give you the kinds of access. The beautiful thing about journalism is that you could be sent to cover a prime minister one day, and then you could be sent to cover a human interest story. You're talking to a mine worker the next day. And you have to be able to change the way that you interact with people, and everybody's got an interesting story, and you have to be able to talk to them. And I think that, you know, one of the great skills that reporters have is being able to get people to trust them, so that they will tell them what's on their mind.
And so you were in Asia, and then after Asia, you went where?
After Asia, I was in Africa for a few years. I was bureau chief in West and Central Africa, and I loved it. But unfortunately, I covered more war there than I covered anything else. And I covered the war in a particularly nasty one in Liberia, which went on for many, many years after I left even. But it was professionally, it was great experience in seeing the cost of war in human terms, because you were able to, as a journalist, cross the line. In those days, I don't know whether that's possible in a lot of conflicts these days, but you could go to both sides. You could go with the rebels and you could spend weeks with them in the bush, or you could cross to the government side with a regular army. Journalists then had a status which they've lost in many ways. It's become eroded. It was the status of the outside observer, and the participants in a conflict needed you, the journalist, to tell their story. You were the way that they got their message out. There was no internet. There was no way of getting onto TV. So you as a journalist were useful to them, to the point that they would actually welcome you or look after you if you were there. I remember once covering a riot in Karachi in Pakistan, and I was with a local Pakistani journalist that was taking me around, and it was a huge back and forth between the army and demonstrators. There were, Molotov cocktails and stones flying, and the army was firing. And I was on the wrong side where I needed to be, on the wrong side of the street. And I was getting a little worried. And my Pakistani fixer, the guy that was looking after me, just walked out and shouted that I wanted to cross the street. And the army stopped firing, and the demonstrators stopped throwing stones. And they watched. I crossed the street, and when I got to the other side, they resumed all their nonsense. I mean, you couldn't do that today. First of all, it's too dangerous probably to be in Karachi running around. But that was the kind of status that journalists had at that time. Now it's changed, and one of the things, and I won't get into the advocacy part of it too much at this point, but one of the reasons that an organization like CPJ is so needed now is that journalists no longer have that kind of slightly protected outside observer status. They are actually targeted deliberately because they are journalists.
Could you say a word, Robert, about the link between being a journalist and advocacy? What were the skills that you learned that help you become a better advocate?
Well, the first skills you learn are how to be a good reporter. That means how to do basic research, whether it's pouring through documents. You'll learn the skill of knowing where to go to get information, whether it's from a government, whether it's from a company or some kind of authority. And then you also learn about how to approach people to get them to talk to you. So as a reporter, what you do with that information is you publish it, but the skills that you need to get that information serve you well if you want to become an advocate. Because one of the things that makes you a strong advocate is authoritative research. You've done your work, you have the documentation. So I make an assertion. I say the army in this country summarily executed these people. That's just a declarative statement if I haven't got any research to back it up. So if you can go and get the documentation and then you make that statement, you're credible. You have a certain authority. And being a successful reporter for a journalism news organization prepares you well to do that. Those skills transfer into the advocacy sphere.
What about the relationship between NGOs and journalists? Do they have something in common in general?
Yes, well, as in my case, and a lot of NGOs are full of former journalists because of the crossover. NGOs are a very, very useful source of information for reporters. Reporters in the field often turn to NGOs to get their the details of what's going on in a country. If you get sent to cover a conflict, for example, you will go knock on the doors of local NGO groups, activists, to learn what's going on. So that they're a great source of information for journalists, and also sometimes goals may align. I mean, some of the NGOs are fighting for basic human rights, maybe freedom of expression, and they're generally out to do good. And I think that journalists, one of the motivations for doing journalism is that you believe that people have a story which needs to be heard, and that you sometimes believe that by airing that story, by publishing it, you could prevent something worse happening, or you could stop something happening, like a war or a conflict or a genocide.
Well, let's back up just a second. You spent some time at Human Rights Watch, I believe. Could you say a little bit about what you did when you were with them?
Yeah, I worked as a consultant with them as a reporter. I was using the skills that I'd had to use when I was working in mainstream journalism. So I came to New York, and at that time, there were, as I said earlier, multiple wars going on in West Africa, and Human Rights Watch wanted to do a report on militias in Ivory Coast. There was a civil war, North versus South, classic kind of conflict. And because I worked there, I was sent back to report on the human rights abuses that were being committed by these militias that were aligned to the government or the rebels. And Human Rights Watch, unlike CPJ, which is looking after journalists and is particularly focused on freedom of expression issues and press freedom violations, Human Rights Watch covers the whole waterfront of human rights. And so they wanted documentary evidence of what these armed groups were doing. That meant interviewing victims, interviewing witnesses of atrocities, and interviewing the perpetrators of those atrocities themselves. And I managed to get all of them to talk to me. And with that, you have case studies, and then Human Rights Watch or any other group can use that information to formulate recommendations, publicize abuses, and then bring pressure. This is the whole point of advocacy, is to bring pressure on the authorities to get them to do something. Could be to stop doing something, as in the case of killing civilians, or get them to comply with international law, whatever it is. But the whole point of it is that you have to have some authority when you speak.
So there's a sense of satisfaction and a sense of power, if you will, in both endeavors, being a journalist and NGO. Do you feel that you have a greater impact in one than in the other, or does it depend on the circumstance?
Well, it's different. I mean, the thing is, when you're a journalist, whether you're a print journalist or a videographer or whatever, you're there. You tell yourself you're there to record events, to document what's going on, and to publicize it. And then, in the traditional field of journalism, your responsibility ends once your story is published, and you're not necessarily engaged in what it is that you're observing. It's the old thing of, when does the news photographer put down the camera and help the person that he or she is filming, who's been shot and is lying on the ground? And that's journalism. Is you say to yourself, if I publicize these killings, or if I publicize this corruption, somebody else will do something about it. But my job as a member of the fourth estate, the press, is to publicize it. In advocacy, you go that extra step. You take that information, and with that, you work to bring about a change, to get someone to change their behavior, to get someone to stop killing their neighbors or whatever it is, through applying pressure. And that's the difference. So I've gone from the one side of the spectrum, which is the observing, to the other side, which is then acting on what I've observed in order to bring about change.
And can you think of an instance where you were successful in bringing about change? What your greatest success would be in your work as in advocacy, either at Human Rights Watch or at CPJ?
Well, I mean, at CPJ, what we do is we try to protect journalists, but there are also lots of journalists around the world. There are more than 200 at the moment who are in jail, and every year there's 50 or 60 or often more journalists that get killed. So one of the things that we do is try to get journalists out of jail. So that when that happens, and it happens every year, that's a great success for us. You know, even this morning, I saw there is a blogger, which is also a journalist in Mauritania, who was under death sentence for writing what was considered to be blasphemous, and in last year was sentenced to death. We, along with other groups, have brought continuous pressure on the government, and this morning the charges that would have led to the death penalty were dropped. Now, if we hadn't taken up that case and other groups hadn't taken up that case, and this is not a high-profile country, it's not a high-profile case, that person would probably not have had the death sentence taken off the table. We still have more work to do. We have to try to get him out of jail. But those are the kinds of everyday small little successes that you can rack up with sustained advocacy, sustained publicity, shining a spotlight on abuses and on dark corners.
Can you say a little bit more about what the Committee to Protect Journalists does specifically? You know, how would you describe its mission, if you will, and what are the biggest challenges going forward?
Well, its mission is very simple. It is to defend press freedom as a value around the world for everybody, and to try to protect journalists when they before they get into trouble, and help them if they do get into trouble. And how do we do that? Well, we use the tools of journalism, which is reporting, and turn them to advocacy. So we document every violation. We take up the cases of journalists, bring them to the attention of bigger bodies, other governments. We organize missions where we go and visit countries. I go on prison visits. If journalists are in jail, you try to get to see them. That may bring about an improvement in their conditions in prison. Journalists come to us when they get out of jail and say, I'm so glad that you kept my case up, because I thought when I was in jail, everybody had forgotten about me. I thought the world didn't care about me. But I would get news that you had issued a statement, or you'd done something on my behalf, and suddenly the guards treated me a little bit better, or I got access to books, or my food improved, and then eventually they may get out. This doesn't happen all the time, but these are the small victories that we can achieve by continually documenting and highlighting these abuses. And unfortunately, the workload doesn't get any smaller. There are some 40 ongoing conflicts around the world, and there is a kind of a trend of authoritarianism that you see in more and more countries. And the press are always the first to feel the effects of any crackdown. You know, the metaphor is they're the canary in the coal mine. If you want to know whether a country is taking a turn for the worse in terms of civil liberties, look at the press in that country. Are they being censored? Are they coming under pressure? Are they being bought up by companies that are friendly to the local dictator? Are journalists being jailed, or are they being killed? And those are the metrics. Those are the measurements that you can use to test the political health of any country.
Well, I have a sense that there are more autocratic regimes now than there were, but I don't know that for a fact. I mean, what's your view on that? Is it do you see a rise in autocratic regimes? Is it a frustration for you, or just a continuing challenge?
They change, but some countries that were a little bit more progressive have got worse. Turkey is a great example, where there's been an ongoing crackdown on the press in Turkey for the last decade or so, and it's much more repressive than it was, even though the number of news outlets and the number of people that are on the internet has increased. it's a more repressive country in terms of journalists. Of course, it's a frustration, but it's something that you have to battle against. Russia is another country. Putin basically took over all broadcast media, or his friends and cronies did. You then have a shrinking of the space for free expression and news, and there are very few independent news outlets now in Russia, which is a very important country. The current president of China has really tightened the Communist Party control of China. And so we see that some of the freedoms that we thought might have come in terms of the press in China have been clawed back, and it's much more difficult for Chinese journalists to work and to get their message out. This also, it's funny, it's ironic that this should come at a time when there are now more people able to practice journalism, if you like, because it's cheap, because the technology enables you to do that. But nevertheless, the governments that repressed through old-fashioned means, by controlling broadcasters and by controlling newsprint and squeezing advertisers, have now learned that the technology that enables you and I to do this and self-publish and talk over the air with is dual use. They can also snoop on you, they can find out where you are, they can follow you, they can surveil you, and they can close you down very easily. So the press freedom space is very complex, and it's not clear that those countries that I just mentioned, China, Turkey, Russia, and now even Egypt has joined them, are going to improve, and that journalism there is going to get easier anytime soon.
Well, how about the changing media landscape? I mean, we have social media, which is playing a very, very important role in the news ecosystem, if you will. You've touched on this, but has it radically changed CPJ's mission, or is it just an added responsibility? How do you keep up with protecting? You said bloggers or journalists. Well, there are lots and lots of bloggers. How do you keep track of what's going on in social media?
Yeah, it's a lot more complex. As you say, the media landscape has changed in the last 10 years out of all recognition. So, before social media and these technologies enable people to publish, journalists worked for news organizations. They carried press cards. They were accredited. There were smaller numbers of people doing what we would call journalism. Now, there are many, many more factors of hundreds of thousands more people doing this profession, and it makes it more difficult for us, because what happens is that there are now more journalists in jail, more can get into trouble, because more people can go to places where there are conflicts, because they can file from there. A few years ago, you could not file necessarily from the front line of a conflict. You had to go back to a base bureau where you had communications, and then you could send your pictures or you could file your stories. Now you can just open up an iPhone and you're immediately online to the world. So that means that more people can do journalism, and they're also more vulnerable, because the people that you're reporting on can see what you're saying, and if they don't like it, they can come and shut you down.
Yeah. What would you say to a young person, Robert, who might be interested in a career in advocacy? Is it something you would recommend that they go into immediately, or do as you did and gain some skills in another profession, in your case, journalism? Is there a career path that is commonly followed?
Well, there are people that go into journalism and then move into advocacy, and then there are people who go straight into advocacy organizations. I think the big thing, the most important thing, is that you have to be committed. This has to be your passion. If you want to earn money, don't go into advocacy, because the entry-level jobs in these NGOs, it's pretty poorly paid. The people that go and do this do it because that's what they care about. That's what motivates them. And you can start off in many different ways, but one of the things that you would do if you go straight into an advocate's position is you'll learn how to be a researcher. You learn how to build a case. It's a bit like a lawyer. You have to build a case, and do the research. And I would say that if you are coming out of college, we have a lot of people come, they want to work here, or they want to work at Human Rights Watch, or they want to work at Amnesty International. There are opportunities. And if you're committed, and if that's what you want to do, I would say go for it, because it is a very rewarding career. It's not something where you get instant gratification. Human rights work is a very slow burn. It can take many years to get a result. But when you get it, you really feel like you've done something to contribute to right or wrong, get someone out of jail, just make someone's life better by what you've been able to do.
And looking back at your own academic career, Robert, what were the things that you studied or didn't study, but that you think would be important to focus on as a student if you are at all interested in eventually going into advocacy?
Well, I think as a general first degree, anything that enables you to learn critical thinking is fine. I studied what we call modern languages. I studied French and German at university because I wanted to travel. Those were the languages that were available to me. But if you're going to go into advocacy, depends what kind of advocacy you're going to do. If you have a law degree, that will give you a certain set of skills which are useful, as I said, in building a case and being, very forensic and deliberate about the way that you do research. If you're going into environmental advocacy or environmental activism, you could be coming out with a science degree, and you could understand a lot more about the specifics of that area that you're covering. But human rights work generally is any good general foundation degree, any degree that or diploma that will give you some language or cultural knowledge, or a law or politics degree.
And looking at the industry as a whole, are there types of advocacy which are, on the upswing, flavor of the day that you see as holding greater promise in the future than others?
Well, some of the popular ones and very relevant ones are around, for example, environmental protection, environmental advocacy, because of climate change. And even now, with the new president and administration in the United States, where the head of the Environmental Protection Agency denies that carbon emissions have any impact on the climate, you've got your work cut out for you in that sphere. Then one of the areas which is a growth area in advocacy has been around Silicon Valley, around technology. So you have a whole new set of people who are out defending the internet, trying to prevent the undermining by law enforcement of encryption standards, against surveillance, against all kinds of digital spying and attempts to hack into your information. That is a real growth area where NGOs, nonprofits, and academic institutions are expending a lot of effort in research. And we at CPJ too, we have set up a tech program where we look at the intersection between technology and journalism, and what that can mean when repressive governments use technology against journalists. And we've also had to set up what we're calling an emergencies response team, which is a way of helping journalists and bloggers educate themselves not only about the physical dangers of reporting, but the electronic and digital dangers of having information which can be hacked and used by others. Because journalism, like human rights work, depends on the ability of the reporter or researcher to keep confidential the identities of some of the vulnerable sources that they may be dealing with. And if you, as a human rights worker, are interviewing victims of some atrocity that do not want to be identified because it makes them victims again, but a country or a regime that wants to keep that information quiet can track what you're doing and know who you're talking to, then that puts everybody at risk. So those are areas that are growing, that didn't have any kind of real presence 10 years ago.
So there's an intersection between computer science and hacking and advocacy. We have time for one more question, Robert. And you've traveled around the world. We've touched on a number of things in this conversation, but let's bring it right back to the United States, where you are based right now. And the question is, how is your job changing, or has it changed with the election of this new administration? What are your thoughts on threats to the press, and what will the Committee to Protect Journalists be doing in the next 4 years in the United States?
Well, one of the things that we're doing is we're having to go back to what I was saying about the importance of research. We are setting up more capacity to track what is happening, to be able to document press freedom violations, incidents which involve attacks, whether verbal or physical, on journalists, because it's very important that is there for journalists and researchers to use. We have witnessed during the campaign for the presidency, and now from the president himself, a torrent of anti-press rhetoric which seeks to delegitimize journalists by calling them liars and fakes. That's very troubling, because what that does is it kind of immunizes the administration from criticism in the future. Because if you keep undermining the press and telling people that everything that they're hearing from the press is lies, then when the press uncovers something, like it doing its job, uncovers some scandal or reports accurately on what the government may be doing, then it can be dismissed as lies, and people may, I kind of think of it, they won't recognize the truth when they see it anymore, because they just got this constant barrage. That's very concerning to us. And also because the United States is traditionally outside been an upholder of press freedom values and First Amendment values, and we as journalists and as advocates have called upon the U.S. to stand up for those values in those countries where the values are under threat. Could be that the American ambassador would raise it in his or her talks with their the local leaders, or that a visiting American official will raise the case of a journalist who's in jail. Those are useful advocacy tools for an organization like us. And if the United States domestically is not upholding those values, then it loses some of its effectiveness as an advocate globally.
Robert, thanks very much. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for your work on behalf of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and on behalf, for that matter, of journalists around the world. I think what you said today will have a very powerful impact on the students who will be watching this, and I want to wish you all the best, and hope to see you soon.
Well, thank you for the opportunity of speaking to such a great audience. I don't get an opportunity like this very often. Thanks, Nelson.
Cheers.